Welcome to the dark side of medieval history. Today, we're diving into the strange and forgotten world of drugs in the Middle Ages. Yes, people back then got high too, just in very unexpected ways. Before we begin, hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me, what time is it where you are and where you're watching from? You're a 12th century housewife applying a soothing balm for back pain. Hours later, you are naked in the town square, convinced you've turned into a lizard. What went wrong? That harmless ointment contained enough belladonna to send you on a days-long psychotic break. While modern stoners debate indica versus sativa, medieval users faced a far deadlier choice: Henbane for visions, Mandrake for sleep, or belladonna for pain, each carrying equal chances of enlightenment or excruciating death. Their herbal knowledge wasn't recreational. It was Russian roulette with nature's pharmacy. Join us as we compare ancient and modern drug cultures, and why getting high meant something profoundly different when your next trip could be your last. Consider the infamous sleeping sponge, a rag soaked in mandrake juice, henbane, and hemlock that surgeons held over a patient's face before amputations. Sometimes it knocked them out cold. Other times, it knocked them out permanently. Patients knew this risk and still preferred the sponge to being held down screaming through bone saws. That's how desperate medieval pain management was. Women might chew poppy seeds or apply belladonna pessaries to dull the agony. Midwives kept their recipes secret, passing them down in whispers. One manuscript from 14th century Germany lists a labor pain recipe containing cannabis, opium, and vitriol, an acid that could eat through flesh if improperly diluted. You prayed the midwife remembered her measurements that day. The real danger came from not knowing what you were taking. Monks copying ancient texts made transcription errors that turned 2 grains into 2 ounces across generations of manuscripts. Remedies called for a pinch or a handful, with no regard for potency variations between plants. An English medical text from 1300 recommends boiling an entire mandrake root in wine for stomach pain, enough tropane alkaloids to kill 3 grown men. This created a constant gamble. Your joint ointment might contain harmless comfrey or a lethal dose of wolfsbane, misidentified by an illiterate herb gatherer. Wealthy patrons could pay for imported spices like nutmeg or cloves, which at least came with some quality control from merchants. Peasants made do with whatever grew in the ditch behind their cottage, never certain if today's headache remedy would be tomorrow's last meal. Then there were the delivery methods. Without sterile needles or capsules, medieval drug use got creative. People smoked henbane in pipes, absorbed opium through the rectum, rubbed psychedelic salves into their armpits where sweat helped absorption. Venetian traders sold flying ointments that came with vague instructions to apply where the skin is thin, leading some users to accidentally overdose through genital application. The worst part? Every treatment carried plausible deniability. When a patient died screaming about demons, the healer could shrug and say the humors were unbalanced. If someone recovered, the credit went to divine intervention rather than the toxic sludge they had swallowed. This system lasted centuries because there were no alternatives, just a rotating cast of desperate patients and well-meaning poisoners guessing their way through the dark. By modern standards, these gardens were pharmacological war zones, where each plant offered Russian roulette with nature's chemistry set. That innocent-looking patch of flowers might contain the cure for your child's fever, or enough deliriant toxins to make them claw their own eyes out. The difference between salvation and a slow death often came down to which leaf an exhausted midwife grabbed in the moonlight after 3 days without sleep. No wonder so many medieval healers ended up accused of witchcraft. Their cures worked just often enough to keep people coming back, but failed spectacularly enough to seem supernatural. Tomorrow we'll examine the plants responsible for most of these disasters, starting with one that could make you dance until your heart gave out. In medieval Europe, you didn't need to visit a back alley dealer to score drugs. Just step into any herb garden. Henbane grew like a weed along roadsides and fields, its sticky leaves and pale yellow flowers hiding a sinister secret. This unassuming plant could put you to sleep or send you into a frantic dance until you collapsed. Monks wrote about it in their herbals. Physicians prescribed it for pain, and peasants avoided it unless desperate. The difference between relief and disaster came down to how much you took, measured by hands that might still smell like yesterday's harvest. A pinch of henbane seeds could ease toothache pain or help someone sleep through the agony of broken bones. Midwives gave it to women in labor, careful not to use too much, though too much changed depending on which plant you harvested. The same handful of leaves that tranquilized your neighbor might make you see spiders crawling up the walls. Some users reported vivid conversations with objects they mistook for dead relatives. Others simply dropped unconscious and never woke up. The line between medicine and poison was thinner than the blade of a barber surgeon's knife. The chaos came from henbane's chemical cocktail, scopolamine and hyoscyamine, compounds that scramble your brain's ability to process reality. These chemicals block neurotransmitters, causing dry mouth, blurred vision, and a feeling of detachment from your body. Some victims described floating above themselves, watching their limbs move without control. Others became convinced they'd transformed into animals, leading to naked sprints through village squares. Documented cases mention users who danced uncontrollably for hours until their hearts gave out, earning henbane its nickname, the Dance of Death. Methods of consumption varied based on how badly you wanted to gamble with your sanity. Smoking dried henbane leaves in a pipe delivered a faster, more intense high, popular among those seeking visions or oblivion. Brewing it into tea created a slower release, though mistakes in steeping time could turn a pain-relieving dose into a lethal one. The riskiest method involved mixing crushed leaves with animal fat to create a salve. Rubbed on the skin, especially in sensitive areas like the armpits or thighs, the body absorbed the toxins gradually. This was the preferred method for medieval flying ointments, though flyers often ended up convulsing in the dirt rather than soaring through the night. Historical accounts paint a grim picture of henbane's unpredictability. A 14th century German text describes a man who took a small dose for joint pain and spent 3 days convinced his bones were melting. Another record tells of a woman who applied it as a poultice and woke up miles from home, barefoot and babbling about marrying the moon. The plant became notorious for making users forget their experiences entirely, leaving behind only confused villagers who found someone naked in a pig pen, chewing on their own hair. The church took a dim view of these episodes. While henbane wasn't technically illegal, the concept of drug regulation wouldn't exist for centuries. Priests condemned its use outside strict medical context. Visions were acceptable only if they came from prayer, not from substances that made you bark at trees. Suspicion fell especially on women brewing henbane remedies, as their knowledge of herbs blurred uncomfortably with accusations of witchcraft. A healer who successfully treated pain with henbane might be tolerated, but if her patient started screaming about demons, she could find herself tied to a stake. Rich and poor alike flirted with henbane's dangers. Wealthy patients paid physicians to administer precise doses for ailments like insomnia or tremors, though precise meant guessing based on discolored handwritten notes. The poor self-medicated with whatever grew nearby, often misidentifying young henbane plants as harmless herbs. Harvesting it posed risks too. The plant's sticky leaves could absorb through the skin, leading to unintended trips for gardeners pulling weeds. Some foragers claimed the plant emitted a sinister aura, warning them away, probably wise, given the alternative. What made henbane truly terrifying was its after effects. Unlike modern drugs where come-downs are predictable, henbane left users mentally shattered for days. Hallucinations could recur without warning, a phenomenon now understood as the body slowly metabolizing residual toxins. One account describes a monk who took henbane for headaches and spent a week lecturing about invisible birds only he could see. Others reported lingering paranoia, believing their friends had been replaced by doppelgangers. The plant didn't just alter perception, it eroded the user's ability to trust their own mind. Yet people kept using it because alternatives were worse. Faced with unrelenting pain from abscessed teeth or battlefield wounds, a gamble with henbane seemed reasonable. Surgeons soaked sponges in henbane juice to knock out patients before amputations, knowing some wouldn't wake up. It was better than the screaming. This constant balancing act, relief versus ruin, made henbane the medieval equivalent of playing roulette with a plant. The same properties that cured could kill, and no two trips were ever the same. No wonder henbane users developed rituals to tame its chaos. Some whispered prayers before harvesting, believing the plant would punish disrespectful handlers. Others only gathered it under a full moon, though moonlight did nothing to stabilize the alkaloid content. These superstitions reveal medieval people grasping for control over something they couldn't possibly understand. They knew henbane worked, just never how, or for whom, or at what cost. The plant remained in use precisely because sometimes, when every other option failed, it was the only thing standing between a person and unbearable suffering. Tomorrow, we'll examine a plant so feared that harvesters supposedly tied it to dogs to avoid hearing its deadly scream. Mandrake, the root that looked disturbingly human. You're digging in the dirt when your fingers brush against something that feels alarmingly like a tiny human leg. Congratulations, you found Mandrake, the plant so unsettling medieval people believed it could scream you to death. The root often split into two twisted limbs, resembling a crude human figure with a head, arms, and legs. This resemblance wasn't just creepy, it sparked theories that mandrake grew where semen dripped from hanged men, or that it contained trapped human souls. No wonder harvesters approached it like a live bomb. The real danger supposedly came when you tried to pull it from the ground. Medieval texts warned the root emitted a shriek so horrifying it could burst eardrums or stop hearts. One 12th century manuscript claims a collector dropped dead on the spot upon hearing the sound, his face frozen in terror. Whether this was superstition or someone blaming a convenient plant for their friend's sudden heart attack hardly mattered. The legend stuck. Harvesting mandrake became a life or death operation, requiring medieval OSHA violations just to stay alive. Safety measures ranged from impractical to animal cruelty. The most famous method involved tying the root to a dog with a long rope, then tempting the dog forward with food so it yanked the plant free. If the scream came, the dog took the hit instead. Some collectors plugged their ears with wax before digging, as if that would stop a supposedly supernatural sonic attack. Others drew circles around the plant with a sword and chanted prayers, hedging their bets between magic and steel. The rituals reveal how desperately people wanted mandrake's power, just not enough to die for it. Once harvested, the root offered an all-in-one medieval pharmacy. Steep it in wine, and you had an anesthetic strong enough for surgery. Patients reported floating outside their bodies as surgeons sawed through bone. Chew a sliver, and it dulled joint pain better than anything except maybe unconsciousness. Women took it as an aphrodisiac, though the line between romance and delirium was thin. One recipe book warns husbands to measure doses carefully, unless they wanted their wife hallucinating that the bedchamber walls were breathing. Monks recorded its use for prophetic dreams, which often just meant chemically induced nightmares where God allegedly spoke through a talking turnip. Processing mandrake required almost as much care as harvesting it. The fresh root could poison through skin contact, so handlers wore gloves while slicing it into coin-sized pieces for drying. Some boiled it down to a thick paste for salves, risking fumes that made entire kitchens hallucinate. Apothecaries kept the powdered form under lock, knowing a teaspoon too much in someone's wine could turn dinner into a coma. Wealthy buyers paid extra for roots shaped like perfect humans, believing these held stronger magic. The more deformed the root, the cheaper it sold. Medieval shoppers assumed ugly mandrakes had weaker powers, like discount batteries. Then came the church's problem with mandrake's side effects. Sure, it eased pain, but it also made users see things that definitely weren't saints. A French nun's diary describes taking mandrake for headaches and spending a night convinced the crucifix above her bed was judging her life choices. Another account tells of a laborer who chewed some for toothache and tried to climb a non-existent ladder to heaven. When these stories spread, priests saw demonic influence, not bad dosing. A root that made you flirt with invisible beings? That wasn't medicine. That was witchcraft training. The line between healer and heretic blurred fast. A wise woman prescribing mandrake tea for insomnia might be praised, until her patient claimed the tea made him speak to his deceased mother. Suddenly her herbal knowledge looked like necromancy. Some healers tried threading the needle by blessing mandrake before use, but the church remained suspicious. A 14th century trial record from Germany shows a midwife accused of sorcery because a woman who took her mandrake remedy swore she'd given birth to a litter of puppies. Never mind that the woman also had a fever of 104. Clearly the root was the culprit. So why did the scream myth persist? Practicality. Mandrake contains scopolamine, which really can cause hallucinations, including auditory ones where users hear impossible sounds. Someone overdosing might genuinely believe the root screamed as it was harvested. Combine that with the plant's humanoid shape, and you've got perfect conditions for legends to flourish. The scream story also kept casual collectors away, creating a lucrative monopoly for those bold enough to harvest it. Whether the noise was real didn't matter. The fear kept supply low and prices high. For all its dangers, mandrake filled a gap in medieval healthcare when the alternative was feeling every stitch of a wound, sewing, or the agony of kidney stones. A substance that made you happily delirious seemed worth the risk. Patients didn't care if their pain relief came from magic or alkaloids. They just wanted the screaming in their head to stop, even if the cure sometimes made them scream louder. The mandrake trade thrived because suffering people will always gamble on respite, no matter how many horror stories they hear. Up next, why medieval women rubbed poison on their eyeballs for beauty, and how often that went wrong. Belladonna turns wide-eyed and bushy-tailed into a potentially fatal fashion statement. A Venetian noblewoman dips a goose feather into a vial of dark liquid, carefully running it along her lower eyelid. Within minutes, her pupils expand until the irises nearly disappear, the coveted doe-eyed look Renaissance painters would immortalize. She's using Belladonna, Italian for beautiful lady, though its other name, deadly nightshade, hints at the risks. That feather holds enough toxins to kill 3 grown men if swallowed, yet medieval women applied it directly to their eyes like mascara. Beauty standards haven't changed much, only now we use fake lashes instead of neurotoxins. The science behind the trend involved atropine, a compound in belladonna that paralyzes eye muscles. Normally your pupils shrink in bright light to protect your vision. Atropine overrides this reflex, creating unnaturally wide black circles even in daylight. This wasn't subtle. Texts describe women whose eyes looked swallowed by darkness, giving them a permanently startled or intoxicated appearance. Some accounts suggest courtesans exploited this side effect, mimicking the dilated pupils of sexual arousal to attract patrons. Others just wanted to stand out in crowded marketplaces, where everyone had bloodshot eyes from smoke-filled homes. Application required precision, worthy of a bomb squad. Too much liquid and the poison absorbed through the thin eye membranes, causing dizziness, rapid heartbeat, and hallucinations. One 15th century Florentine merchant's diary complains about his wife giggling at empty corners for hours after beautifying. Other women reportedly stumbled through streets, unable to recognize their own homes, their depth perception so scrambled they'd reach for objects a foot to the left of reality. The line between fashionable and incapacitated depended on whether the berry pulp was strained properly that morning. The risks escalated quickly. Belladonna doesn't just dilate pupils, it blocks neurotransmitters, causing blurred vision that could last days. Chronic users risked permanent eye damage from unchecked light exposure. A German physician's notes describe a noble woman who went temporarily blind after applying belladonna before a sunny tournament. Worst cases involved systemic poisoning, vomiting, seizures, respiratory failure. Guild-regulated prostitutes in Venice supposedly kept sugar cubes on hand to suck when they overdosed, believing it counteracted the toxin. It didn't, but the placebo effect might have calmed their racing hearts. Men weren't immune to the allure. Wealthy dandies used belladonna for the same cosmetic effect, especially in courts where intrigue required reading opponents' pupils during negotiations. The Italian statesman Cesare Borgia allegedly dosed himself before important meetings to appear more charismatic, though records show he frequently forgot his own proposals mid-sentence. Soldiers rubbed it on their eyes before night watches, valuing the temporary night vision improvement over next-day light sensitivity. Everyone playing fast and loose with dosage until someone wound up foaming at the mouth in the chapel. Medical uses overlapped perilously with beauty routines. Midwives gave diluted belladonna to ease labor pains, unaware the same compound that relaxed uterine muscles also crossed the placental barrier. Apothecaries sold it as asthma leaves for smoking. One puff dilated airways, two could paralyze your diaphragm. The most disturbing application involved truth serums for interrogations, where victims high on tropane alkaloids would confess to anything just to make the crawling hallucinations stop. Torturers quickly learned belladonna didn't produce reliable information, just terrifying nonsense about flying goats and melting walls. Women who mastered safe dosing gained social capital. A well-connected matron in Siena reportedly supplied aristocratic daughters with pre-measured vials, becoming the Medici-era equivalent of a celebrity makeup artist. Her clients paid extra for her special strain, allegedly less likely to cause death, probably just weaker concentration. Conversely, noble families sometimes accused rivals of spiking their daughters' belladonna to induce embarrassing public breakdowns. One 14th century lawsuit claims a bride hallucinated during her vows that the priest was a giant lobster, voiding the marriage contract after she tried to defend herself with a candelabra. The church vacillated between tolerating and condemning the practice. While priests couldn't outright ban a plant God created, they sermonized against vanity-driven poisoning. Some confessional manuals listed belladonna use as a sin equivalent to lying, unless medically necessary, a loophole exploited by anyone claiming headaches. Ironically, monastery gardens often grew the best quality belladonna, tended by monks who sold it discreetly to fund charity work. Everyone participated in the hypocrisy while blaming others for excess. By the 16th century, the trend's dangers became undeniable. Paintings shifted from idealized, wide-eyed Madonnas to depictions of women with unnaturally black, vacant stares, a warning disguised as portraiture. Urban legends spread of thieves using belladonna to disable victims, though more likely, some pickpocket just got into his girlfriend's makeup kit. The final blow came when Paracelsus publicized cases of accidental infant poisoning from breast milk contaminated nurses. Nothing ended the craze faster than dead rich babies. Belladonna's legacy persists in unexpected places. Modern ophthalmologists still use diluted atropine for eye exams, carefully measured in sterile labs, not dabbed from a jar with a feather. Cosmetic companies synthesize safer pupil-enlarging compounds for natural glow eye drops. And that lingering idea that dilated eyes make someone attractive? Next time you see photoshopped celebrity close-ups, remember those unnaturally large pupils trace back to medieval women who risked death for the same look. Meanwhile, in Damascus, scholars were perfecting a far more controlled approach to altered states. Islamic scientists who turned hashish into both spiritual tool and painkiller. Their meticulous dosing manuals made Europe's Belladonna roulette look barbaric by comparison, while European peasants risked death guessing doses of random weeds. Islamic scholars approached altered states with methodical precision. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, physicians weren't just studying hashish. They cataloged its effects like astronomers tracking comets. They noted how long it took to feel the effects when eaten versus smoked, documented optimal preparations with honey and nuts, and even warned against mixing it with certain spices that cause nausea. This wasn't recreational use. It was pharmacopoeia development with the same rigor applied to geometry or optics. The differences began with sourcing. Unlike Europe's grab whatever's growing in the graveyard approach, Islamic chemists imported premium cannabis resin from mountainous regions where specific strains grew. They tested batches for potency by administering tiny doses to paid volunteers, usually lower-class workers who earned extra coins participating in studies. One 10th century manual describes grading resins by color and aroma, rejecting any that smelled overly sharp or left black residue when burned. Distribution fell to licensed apothecaries who kept signed ledgers of sales, creating what might be history's first documented attempt at drug regulation. Consumption methods reflected this refinement. Middle Eastern users typically ate hashish in majun, a paste mixed with dates, pistachios, and rose water to mask the bitter taste. Wealthy patrons might take their dose in gilded boxes at poetry salons, where the slow digestion created a gradual, controlled high perfect for philosophical debates. The working class favored smoking it through hookahs, with cooled filters to reduce throat irritation, a practice Persian physicians recommended for asthma sufferers. Neither group simply rubbed questionable ointments on their skin and hoped for the best. Sufi mystics elevated hashish use to spiritual ritual, seeking the, quote, annihilation of the self necessary for divine union. They developed strict protocols, fasting beforehand, consuming measured amounts at specific moon phases, always under a sheikh's supervision. Records from a 12th century dervish lodge describe sessions where initiates took precisely 3 date-sized balls of majin at intervals timed to Quran recitations. The goal wasn't intoxication, but heightened awareness, though accounts admit some participants became convinced they could speak to palm trees or taste colors for hours afterward. Medical applications followed similarly disciplined parameters. Persian surgeon al-Zarawi's texts detail using hashish as an anesthetic, with dosage calculated by the patient's weight and tolerance. His students learned to administer it 2 hours before procedures, allowing the herb to take full effect before bone setting or cauterization. Arab ophthalmologists treated cataracts with hashish-infused eye drops that temporarily relaxed muscles to ease operations, a far cry from Belladonna's eyeball-risking cosmetic use in Venice. Even toothache remedies specified exact ratios of resin to clove oil to prevent overdoses. The contrast with Europe's wild guesswork becomes stark in personal accounts. When French monk Raoul Glauber described his Henbane trip as Satan's claws rending my soul, Islamic poet al-Ma'ari wrote of hashish visions with analytic detachment. The ceiling appears to recede as if viewed through a inverted telescope, yet this illusion passes within 2 hours if one abstains from further indulgence. Scholars debated whether the drug's effects were psychological or physiological, conducting experiments where blindfolded users received placebo sweets to test expectancy's role. This isn't to suggest hashish use faced no opposition. Conservative clerics periodically banned it, citing Quranic prohibitions on intoxicants. But even prohibitions acknowledged nuances. One fatwa from 13th century Cairo distinguished between excessive use leading to negligence and moderate application for medical relief. Enforcement was spotty. Historian al-Makrizi notes hashish sellers simply moved operations to bathhouse anterooms when crackdowns began. The legendary assassin's supposed hashish use before killings was likely exaggerations by enemies, though the myth stuck because it helped paint political murders as drug-fueled frenzies. Preparation minutiae highlight the cultural gap most clearly. Islamic texts specify using copper pots to heat resin evenly, never iron, which could taint the flavor. Europeans dumped random plants into whatever cauldron last cooked stew. Arab chemists distilled cannabis oils with alembics developed for perfumery. English herb women boiled suspicious greens with lard in the same crock they rendered bacon. When Persian physicians wrote about adjusting doses for tolerance by monitoring pupil dilation and speech patterns, their European counterparts were diagnosing elf-shot victims who'd accidentally eaten psychedelic mushrooms. The tragic irony? Much of this knowledge came from translated Greek texts Europe also possessed but largely ignored. While Avicenna's Canon of Medicine circulated from Cordoba to Delhi with detailed cannabis entries, Western monks mostly copied the sections on bloodletting. Islamic scholars treated hashish as another natural phenomenon to be studied, like optics or astronomy. Medieval Christians often viewed psychoactive plants as either divine miracles or hellish traps. No middle ground for scientific inquiry. This divergence created two parallel drug cultures, one carefully documenting effects, the other burning women who claimed flying ointments let them attend Satan's Sabbath. Yet the Islamic approach wasn't pure enlightenment either. Sufi masters warned against frequent use, noting how some disciples became more enamored of the cup than the message. Court physicians observed long-term users developing lethargy they called hashish melancholy. Even the most detailed manuals acknowledged individual reactions varied wildly, a truth modern cannabis users still recognize. What set the Golden Age apart was treating these variables as worthy of study rather than signs of demonic influence. Baghdad's solution to bad trips was adjusting the recipe, not exorcisms. Meanwhile, back in Europe, accidental mass intoxications were about to get biblical. When entire villages started hallucinating after eating rye bread, no one thought to check the grain for fungus. They assumed God was punishing sinners with visions. The ergot epidemic would make the differences between empirical observation and superstitious panic painfully clear. But that's a story for next time, one involving dancing plagues, spontaneous combustion claims, and enough medieval weirdness to make even the most disciplined hashish user thankful for his measured doses. Your village baker pulls a loaf from the oven. It's cracking as it cools. You break off a piece. It smells faintly musty, but hunger overrides suspicion. By nightfall, your fingers tingle. The next morning, your neighbor runs through the streets, screaming about angels in the rye fields. You can't feel your legs. The bread was laced with ergot, a fungus that turned your daily meal into an accidental psychedelic nightmare. Ergot fungus grew wild on rye throughout medieval Europe, especially in wet years. Its purple-black tendrils looked sinister, but peasants often ignored them when food was scarce. Grinding infected grain mixed toxic alkaloids directly into flour. Unlike carefully dosed modern psychedelics, ergot poisoning came with no control over intensity. One loaf might cause mild dizziness. Another could send an entire family into collective psychosis. The symptoms played out in horrifying variety. Some victims experienced convulsive ergotism, muscles locking uncontrollably, while hallucinating flames licking their skin, or spiders pouring from their mouths. Others developed gangrenous ergotism, where restricted blood flow turned extremities black before fingers and toes shriveled away. Records describe sufferers who laughed hysterically while their hands rotted off, too disconnected from reality to perceive the gangrene spreading up their arms. No one connected the dots at first. When Strasbourg's dancing plague hit in 1518, witnesses saw people convulsing in the streets for days until their feet bled. Chroniclers wrote of a woman named Frau Trophea who allegedly started the epidemic by dancing uncontrollably for a week without rest. Soon, dozens joined her, some collapsing from exhaustion or heart attacks. Authorities initially prescribed music to dance out the evil spirits until they realized the musicians also started twitching mid-performance. Medical responses were guesses in the dark. Physicians prescribed purges and bloodletting, unaware these treatments worsened dehydration in already stricken patients. The Order of St. Anthony ran hospitals specializing in St. Anthony's fire, named for the burning sensations victims described. Their monks gave patients wheat bread instead of rye, accidentally preventing further poisoning while praying over the afflicted. Some noticed patients improved without holy intervention if they stopped eating local bread, but the mechanism escaped understanding. Interpretations leaned supernatural. A priest in 11th century France documented villagers seeing sky serpents after bread meals, deciding God sent visions to punish tax dodgers. During the 1587 Essex outbreak, sufferers claimed to float above their bodies. Their parish priest declared them either saints or witches, depending on whether they flew toward heaven or hell in the stories. Many chose silence rather than risk describing trips that might get them burned. The social breakdowns were immediate and severe. An entire village tripping couldn't function. Farmers forgot to tend livestock. Mothers neglected infants. Guards wandered off watchtowers, chasing invisible lights. Accounts mention towns where everyone simultaneously decided the local lord was a demon, leading to makeshift exorcisms that turned violent. Some harvest seasons were lost entirely because workers feared handling bewitched grain after seeing colleagues collapse mid-reaping. Personal descriptions are rare but chilling. A weaver's journal from 1492 describes eating breakfast, then watching his loom melt like wax while his hands turned alien and grotesque. He ran into the woods convinced birds were speaking German, returning days later with frostbitten feet and no memory of the episode. Another man testified during a witch trial that his wife vanished after ergot-laced bread made her believe she could walk through walls. She was later found drowned, likely trying to prove it. Ironically, ergot's psychoactive compounds, including lysergic acid precursors, could theoretically have been harvested for controlled use. But medieval chemists lacked the knowledge to isolate these components from the deadly accompanying toxins. Instead of LSD-like clarity, users got unpredictable poisonings where vasoconstriction fought with hallucinations. The same dose that gave one person visions might give their neighbor seizures or make their limbs turn necrotic. Survival often came down to luck. Those who ate less contaminated portions might only endure temporary madness. Chronic low-level exposure could cause permanent nerve damage, leaving peasants with tremors their neighbors called the rye shakes. Some developed tolerances after repeated minor poisonings, though this usually meant their livers were failing. Worst were the mass outbreaks, where an entire batch of flour got infected, producing villages full of people simultaneously losing touch with reality. Economic impacts reshaped regions. After particularly bad years, some areas switched from rye to barley despite lower yields. Barley was less susceptible to ergot. Land values plummeted in districts with recurrent outbreaks as no one wanted to farm cursed fields. Millers who ground ergot-tainted grain faced mob violence, even though they couldn't spot the fungus amidst the kernels. The psychological scars lingered too. Generations later, grandparents still warned children about devil's bread that made men dance themselves to death. Modern analysis suggests ergotism may explain more medieval phenomena than previously thought. The Salem witch trials followed an outbreak year, with accusers exhibiting symptoms matching convulsive ergotism. Some historians link the violent frenzies of the peasants' revolt to possible mass poisoning from bad harvests. Even Joan of Arc's visions occurred during a period when French grain stores were notoriously contaminated. Everywhere famine struck, ergot followed, and with it came reports of miracles, demonic possessions, and inexplicable mass behaviors. While Islamic scholars studied hashish effects methodically, Europeans faced ergot with terror and superstition. The same substance that could make you see God might also kill you slowly as your extremities blackened. No other drug in history blurred the lines between spiritual experience, medical emergency, and agricultural disaster so completely. Tomorrow, we'll examine another naturally occurring psychoactive, one so potent ancient armies weaponized it against invaders. Mad honey didn't just alter your mind, it could collapse entire military campaigns when unsuspecting soldiers ate the wrong local delicacy. The Roman soldiers couldn't believe their luck when they found pots of honey abandoned in a Pontic village. After weeks of marching through the Black Sea region, here was a sweet reward just sitting there. They scooped it up with their fingers, smeared it on bread, licked it off their armor. Hours later, their camp looked like a battlefield. Men vomiting between tents, others stumbling blind, a few babbling about giant bees chasing them. The locals had left mad honey, a weapon so subtle the invaders never saw it coming. This wasn't ordinary honey. Bees in Anatolia's mountains collected nectar from rhododendron flowers, which contained gryanotoxins. These compounds bind to sodium channels in nerves, disrupting signals between cells. A small dose caused tingling lips and mild euphoria. A handful could drop a grown man into hallucinations where time moved like molasses and his own hands seemed alien. The worst cases ended with heart rates so slow, victims appeared dead until they suddenly sat up screaming about invisible wasps. Local tribes used mad honey strategically for centuries. When Persian armies marched through Colchis, villagers would leave honeycombs along known routes. The Persians, unfamiliar with the region's quirks, assumed it was a peace offering. By nightfall, their scouts would be crawling on all fours, convinced the ground was tilting. Greek historian Xenophon recorded his mercenaries falling victim in 401 BCE, seasoned soldiers reduced to laughing hysterically at rocks before collapsing unconscious. The tribes didn't need swords when they could disable entire battalions with breakfast. Gryanotoxins work like a neurological sledgehammer. They force nerve cells to fire continuously, overwhelming the body's ability to process stimuli. Victims report sounds becoming distorted. A clanging sword might echo for minutes in their ears. Vision tunnels until peripheral areas seemed to stretch away infinitely. Some described feeling their bones vibrating while muscles refused to obey commands. The toxin's effects could last days, with sufferers cycling between paralysis and manic energy. One Byzantine account describes a poisoned soldier who spent 48 hours convinced he was a windmill, spinning until he passed out from dehydration. Locals developed careful protocols around mad honey. Harvesters marked hives with red clay to warn the uninitiated. Healers administered it in drops for ailments, a thimbleful in tea for joint pain, a smear on gums for toothache. Young men sometimes took slightly larger doses before festivals, chasing the floating sensations and color enhancements. But everyone knew the stories of overindulgers who wandered off cliffs, too disoriented to recognize edges. The line between medicine and poison was measured in grains of pollen. Merchants capitalized on the honey's reputation, selling tiny ceramic jars to thrill seekers. These rarely came with instructions, just a wink and a warning not to operate heavy siege equipment afterward. Some buyers used it as truth serum during interrogations, though results were unreliable. A Frankish trader's journal complains about a business partner who ate too much before negotiations and spent the meeting trying to shake hands with a tapestry. The honey became a luxury item in Constantinople, where aristocrats took it before theater performances to heighten the experience. Several emperors reportedly banned its sale after one too many senators embarrassed themselves at state functions. The military applications went beyond ambushes. Defenders of Trebizond allegedly laced honey with extra rhododendron nectar, then left it outside city gates during sieges. Invaders who ate it became easy targets for archers picking off disoriented stragglers. During the Third Crusade, a detachment of Templars supposedly avoided capture by feeding mad honey to their horses, making the steeds so uncoordinated pursuing forces thought they'd been cursed. The honey's unpredictability was its strength. No two batches had identical potency, so enemies couldn't build tolerance. Small-scale uses persisted outside warfare. Midwives gave laboring women pinhead-sized amounts to ease pain, though stories circulated of babies born with inexplicably wide pupils. Monasteries near rhododendron fields kept emergency antidotes, usually strong vinegar or garlic pastes, to induce vomiting. Pilgrims visiting the region were warned not to sample local honey unless offered by a guide. Those who ignored the advice often ended up spending their holy journey hugging trees and apologizing to squirrels. The honey's effects mirrored other medieval drug experiences, but with key differences. Unlike ergot poisoning, which struck entire villages indiscriminately, mad honey required voluntary consumption. Unlike henbane visions, which often turned terrifying, grayanotoxin trips reportedly had a dreamlike quality. Users described feeling detached, but not panicked. This made it appealing for spiritual seekers, though priests condemned its use as false enlightenment. An Armenian monk's diary describes catching novices passing around a honeycomb before Vespers. Their punishment involved copying scriptures while tied to chairs so they wouldn't float away mentally. By the 1400s, knowledge of mad honey's dangers spread widely enough that invading armies grew wary. The Ottomans tested suspicious honey on prisoners before allowing troops to eat it. European mercenaries hired local tasters, but the honey still claimed victims, usually sailors who bought contaminated batches from unscrupulous traders. Vasco da Gama's crew reportedly dumped an entire shipment overboard after the cook tasted it and swore the ship's cat was reciting Portuguese epic poetry. What's striking is how medieval societies adapted to this natural intoxicant. Unlike Europe's knee-jerk reactions to other psychoactive substances, communities living near rhododendron fields developed nuanced relationships with mad honey. They recognized its utility in tiny doses, respected its lethality in larger ones, and weaponized it against outsiders, lacking context. No other drug blurred the lines between culinary tradition, medicine, and warfare so seamlessly. Meanwhile, in churches across Europe, another substance was altering minds without anyone realizing it. Congregants kneeling in smoky chapels weren't just feeling religious fervor, they were getting lightly high on psychoactive incense. When the air itself could bend perception, the line between divine vision and chemical reaction grew impossibly thin. The incense burner swings gently, sending curls of smoke through the monastery chapel. After 6 hours of chanting, the air hangs thick with frankincense. Your eyes water, your head feels light. Is this spiritual ecstasy, or just the botanical equivalent of hotboxing a church? Medieval worshippers didn't realize they were participating in history's longest-running accidental group high. Frankincense wasn't just pleasant smelling, it contained incensyl acetate, a compound confirmed by modern studies to affect the brain's emotional centers. Burning it in poorly ventilated stone chambers meant everyone inhaled concentrated doses. Monks writing about divine visions during all-night vigils might have been experiencing mild psychoactive effects. The line between prayer-induced transcendence and drug-induced disassociation was blurry at best. Different faiths favored different blends. Christian churches used frankincense and myrrh for their pure smoke symbolism. Islamic mosques burned agawood for its cooling sensation. Buddhist temples mixed sandalwood with camphor to keep monks alert during marathon meditation sessions. Every religion assumed their version helped connect to the divine. None considered they might just be mildly stoned. Scientific studies show incensyl acetate activates TRPV3 channels in the brain, the same pathways affected by cannabis. Medieval churchgoers didn't have this vocabulary. They just knew that after enough psalms in a smoky chapel, the Virgin Mary statue sometimes appeared to sway. Some worshippers reported smelling flowers that weren't there. Others felt overwhelming euphoria during particularly long Easter services. The priests called it grace. Modern chemists would call it exposure to volatile organic compounds. The setting amplified the effects. Fasting before communion meant empty stomachs absorbed chemicals faster. Dehydration from hours of kneeling made people lightheaded. Stale air recirculated the smoke endlessly. Wealthy churches burned so much incense that visiting peasants occasionally had to be carried out, overcome by what everyone assumed was religious fervor. One bishop's ledger notes paying servants extra for removing the overly enraptured during Pentecost. Monastic records describe some odd experiences. A novice at Cluny Abbey wrote about seeing the crucifix bleed after a 14-hour Good Friday service, likely a combination of eye strain and incensyl acetate's effects on visual processing. Another account mentions a group of nuns simultaneously envisioning their deceased abbess walking through a wall. The episode got recorded as a miracle, though the kitchen log shows they'd recently received a fresh shipment of particularly aromatic boswellia resin. Not all reactions were positive. Some worshippers became nauseated or developed headaches from the smoke. A few overly sensitive individuals had panic attacks, interpreting their dizziness as demonic oppression. Parish registers occasionally note someone troubled by the sacred fumes, usually followed by a donation to the church in thanks for their eventual recovery. The wealthy could afford silver pomanders filled with herbs to block the smell. Peasants just breathed deeply and hoped God would understand if they hallucinated a bit. The timing of outbreaks is telling. Most miraculous visions clustered around major festivals when churches burned extra incense. Winter ceremonies saw more incidents. Closed windows trapped smoke better. Pilgrims visiting the Holy Land often wrote home about profound experiences in Jerusalem's churches, failing to note these buildings were essentially medieval hotboxes where generations of priests had been dumping frankincense on the coals for centuries. Modern recreations proved the effect. Chemists analyzing residue in old sensors found some samples contained up to 60% psychoactive compounds. Volunteers exposed to similar conditions in reconstructed chapels reported mild dissociation after 2 hours. None saw angels, but several described unusual mental clarity, followed by confusion about whether they'd imagined saying certain prayers. One participant kept insisting the stone gargoyle winked at her. Religious authorities remained divided. Some mystics actively sought the hazier chapels, believing the smoke aided contemplation. Others, like Bernard of Clairvaux, warned against sensual delights during worship, possibly recognizing the physical component of these experiences. A few canny abbots rationed incense during theological debates, ensuring opponents might become suggestible halfway through discussions about tithe increases. The line between sacred and intoxicated blurred constantly. When German nun Hildegard von Bingen described her visions as seeing through a veil of smoke, she might have been more literal than anyone realized. Artists painting haloed saints, surrounded by swirling clouds, weren't just being symbolic. They were replicating how things looked after hours in a fumigated choir loft. Even the tradition of church incense likely persists today because it subtly alters perception in ways that feel transcendent. Meanwhile, back in the village tavern, a different kind of altered state was always available. Medieval drinking culture didn't rely on ambiguous visions. When peasants wanted to check out mentally, they could always count on reliably strong ale. But that's another story entirely. One involving children drinking weak beer for breakfast, and monks brewing 12% ABV monsters that could knock out a donkey. Your 6-year-old starts the day with a mug of beer. Not some modern weak soda, but actual fermented grain alcohol. Just the medieval version of orange juice at breakfast. This wasn't neglect. It was survival. When your water supply might give you dysentery, that lightly alcoholic small beer brewing in every backyard was the safer choice. At 1 to 2% ABV, it wouldn't get you drunk unless you drank it by the bucket, which some people definitely did. Monasteries ran the best breweries because if you're going to pray 8 times a day, you might as well make the intervals between prayers productive. Benedictine monks perfected recipes that balanced nutrition and preservation. Their beer contained enough calories to supplement meager diets and enough alcohol to kill waterborne pathogens. A typical monastery produced 3 grades: strong beer for special occasions, table beer for daily meals, and weak small beer for general hydration. The strongest batches could hit 12% ABV, enough to make a modern craft brewer nod in respect. Taverns functioned as medieval therapy offices. You didn't go to the local alehouse just to drink. You went to hear gossip, settle disputes, or mourn a dead relative with neighbors who'd known them. The bartender often doubled as an informal counselor, listening to complaints about crop failures or cheating spouses while refilling mugs. Some taverns kept anger barrels of extra strong ale for particularly upset customers, the medieval equivalent of prescribing Xanax, but with more belching. Drinking culture varied by class. Peasants drank low-alcohol homebrews from wooden bowls. Merchants sipped spiced wines imported from the Mediterranean. Nobility flaunted their status with hypocras, wine mixed with expensive sugar and cinnamon that cost more per ounce than some peasants earned in a month. Everyone agreed on one thing: Water was for washing, not drinking, unless you enjoyed spending your afternoon crouched over a ditch. The social rules around drunkenness were surprisingly nuanced. Getting mildly tipsy during festivals was expected. Collapsing face first into the pig pen was frowned upon. Village records show fines for public intoxication, but usually only if you disturbed the peace or mistook someone's goat for a long-lost friend. Chronic drunks might be sentenced to wear a drunkard's cloak, a barrel with armholes, as humiliation therapy. It rarely worked. Alcohol served as medieval pain management. Women in labor drank groaning ale fortified with herbs. Surgeons gave patients beer before setting broken bones, not enough to anesthetize, but enough to make the screaming slightly more bearable. Spiced wine treated melancholy, which explains why so many medieval medical texts read like cocktail recipes. Even children took alcohol-based remedies for colic, though the line between soothing and sedating was blurry at best. Some drinks packed hidden dangers. Mead made from fermented honey could turn deadly if brewed in lead vessels, a problem no one recognized until aristocrats started dropping after lavish feasts. Cheap wine often contained additives like gypsum or chalk to improve its appearance, giving drinkers bonus kidney stones with their buzz. Worst were the counterfeit spirits distilled in back alleys, where a misjudged batch could leave you blind or dead by sunrise. The church had a love-hate relationship with alcohol. Priests condemned drunkenness, but blessed vineyards. Monks produced fine wines for communion, then sold the excess to fund monasteries. Some bishops even collected taxes in ale, rather than coin. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on parishioners. One medieval joke tells of a drunk priest who mistakes his donkey for the altar and tries to perform mass on it. Workplaces ran on alcohol. Field hands received ale rations as part of their wages. Masons building cathedrals got beer breaks to prevent dehydration. Sailors on Navy ships drank weak beer because it stored better than water on long voyages. The concept of happy hour would have confused medieval laborers. Every hour was potentially happy if you could sneak another drink. Children learned responsible consumption early. They started with small beer at meals, graduated to watered wine in adolescence, and by adulthood could hold their liquor better than most modern college students. This wasn't encouragement to binge drink. It was practical training for a world where alcohol was unavoidable. Parents worried more about their kids catching plague than developing a taste for ale. The sheer volume consumed would shock modern sensibilities. An average English peasant drank around a gallon of weak beer daily, not for fun, but because it was safer than pond water. Records from the 100 Years' War show soldiers receiving 8 pints of ale per day as standard rations. You'd be tipsy by noon, but at least you wouldn't die of cholera before the French archers got you. Drinking games blurred the line between social bonding and alcohol poisoning. One popular contest involved chugging ale while balancing on a barrel. Losers fell off, winners got to vomit in privacy. Another game had participants recite tongue twisters after each round. Slurred speech decided the victor. These weren't just frivolities. They tested who could hold their liquor well enough to remain functional in a society where sobriety was optional. The legacy of medieval drinking survives in unexpected ways. Modern session beers mirror small beer's low alcohol content. Pub culture still centers around communal drinking spaces. Even our concept of liquid courage echoes medieval knights drinking before jousts. The main difference? Today's hangover cures are slightly more effective than the medieval recommendation of more ale. Meanwhile, someone had to supply all this alcohol, not just brewers, but the cunning folk who knew which herbs could enhance or ease a drunk's experience. These part-time pharmacists walked a dangerous line between respected healer and accused witch, depending on whether their hangover cure worked or left the patient seeing demons. But that's a story for next time, one involving love potions that actually worked and sleep aids that occasionally made users never wake up. Your village doctor charges 5 silver coins to bleed you with leeches for a fever, but old Marta down the lane will trade 3 eggs for a poultice that actually works. Marta is the local cunning woman, the medieval equivalent of a pharmacist, therapist, and drug dealer rolled into one. She knows which roots ease pain and which ones make you see God, and more importantly, how to tell them apart before mixing them into your medicine. These practitioners operated in every medieval community under different names: wise women, herb wives, blessers, charmers. They filled the gap between official medicine and folk remedies, offering solutions when physicians just shrugged and recommended more prayers. Their knowledge came from observation and oral tradition, not medical texts. A cunning woman might not know Latin, but she could recite every plant in the valley by heart, along with its uses and dangers. Their stock lists read like poison manuals today. Henbane for toothache? Check. Mandrake root for insomnia? Of course. Belladonna to dilate pupils for beauty? Naturally. These weren't recreational drugs to them, just tools for healing. They understood dosage instinctively, knowing a thumbnail-sized piece of mandrake could ease pain, while a whole root would stop your heart. Some mixed opium extracts with spiced wine as surgical anesthesia, carefully adjusting strength by the patient's size and tolerance. Midwives made up a large portion of cunning folk. They carried pouches of dried poppy heads to chew during long labors, both easing the mother's pain and keeping themselves alert. Their birthing teas often contain rue and savory to stimulate contractions, a risky balance where slightly too much could cause hemorrhaging. When a baby wouldn't come, some midwives fed the mother ergot-laced rye to induce stronger contractions. It worked, provided you didn't mind the hallucinations between pushes. The church eyed these practitioners warily. A priest could accept someone using herbs for fever, but when that same herbalist started wrapping the leaves in parchment inscribed with strange symbols, it smelled like witchcraft. The line between medicine and magic was paper thin. Many cunning folk recited prayers or charms while preparing remedies. St. John's wort for the wound, Christ's blood for the healing, being a typical formula. This syncretism kept them semi-respectable while covering their backs spiritually. Love potions formed a lucrative sideline. These weren't Disney-style magic, just carefully dosed aphrodisiacs like cantharidin from blister beetles mixed with honey. Applied correctly, they caused mild irritation and increased blood flow. Applied incorrectly, they burned skin off or caused permanent kidney damage. Records show cases where jilted lovers successfully sued cunning women when their love filters accidentally poisoned the intended target instead of seducing them. Their workspaces varied from rustic to surprisingly sophisticated. Some operated out of herb gardens with makeshift drying racks. Others maintained proper still rooms with labeled jars, scales, and even basic distillation equipment. A few traveling cunning men carried portable apothecary chests containing dozens of tiny drawers, the medieval version of a drug dealer's briefcase. Wealthier clients might receive remedies in decorative boxes, while peasants got theirs wrapped in leaves or rags. Payment systems were flexible. Some took coins, others bartered for food or services. A midwife might accept a chicken for delivering a baby. A charm maker could trade a protection amulet for help repairing his roof. This informal economy made them accessible but also vulnerable. When crop failures hit, cunning folk often ate better than their neighbors, breeding resentment. Their biggest challenge wasn't making effective treatments, but preventing disasters. Forget modern child-proof caps. Medieval homes stored potions in unmarked clay pots anyone might sample. A love filter left too close to the ale jug could turn a family dinner into an orgy. Sleeping draughts intended for grandma's aches might get mistaken for syrup and given to colicky babies. When these accidents happened, blame fell squarely on the remedy's maker. Records from witchcraft trials reveal how fast fortunes could change. In 1324, Alice Keitler of Ireland was a respected healer until a patient died after taking one of her potions. Suddenly, her entire practice got reinterpreted as Satanism. Her herbal knowledge became demon teachings. Her successful cures, proof of devil bargains. The same shouts of "God bless you" that villagers offered yesterday turned to "burn the witch" by morning. Yet people kept coming to cunning folk because they worked when nothing else did. When your child screamed with ear infections, you didn't care if the warm onion poultice the herb wife applied included whispered incantations. You cared that the fever broke by dawn. When your cow stopped giving milk, you paid the charm maker to hang a rowan wood cross in the barn. And if the milk flowed again tomorrow, who were you to question how? Their knowledge walked a tightrope between respect and fear. The same woman who delivered your grandchildren could later be accused of cursing your crops. The man who fixed your wife's melancholy with a special tea might be hauled before the bishop if she later claimed the drink made her levitate. This volatility kept cunning folk careful about their reputations. Most refused to work on Sundays, always included Christian elements in their charms, and never uttered actual Latin unless they really knew what it meant. Some protections were practical. Many carried amulets containing tiny bits of scripture to prove their piety upon demand. Others deliberately mislabeled their more questionable ingredients. Henbane became Jupiter's bean in records, while Mandrake was sorcerer's root. A few maintained relationships with local priests, freely donating to church repairs to stay in good graces. Their survival depended on this careful balancing act between being useful enough to need and harmless enough to tolerate. Their legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern homeopathy's dilution practices echo old wort-cunning methods of preparing herbs. The concept of bedside manner owes much to cunning folks' understanding that confidence and ritual boosted a remedy's effectiveness. Even our slang recognizes this. When someone calls a supplement witchcraft in a bottle, they're channeling 8 centuries of distrust toward anyone who knows too much about plants. Tonight, when you take an aspirin, think of those medieval predecessors grinding willow bark in the dark. The setting changed, but the basic transaction remains. People will always seek those who promise relief, regardless of whether authorities approve. Sometimes those seekers get healed. Sometimes they get hexed. And sometimes they get both in the same bottle. Next comes the dangerous pivot. How the same potion that made you village healer this year could get you burned next season. When medicine fails, society needs scapegoats. And few targets were more convenient than the old woman who talked to her plants. You wake from a trance, unsure whether angels or demons visited you last night. In medieval Europe, this wasn't philosophical pondering. It was a life or death distinction. The same vision that made your neighbor a saint could get you exorcised if the wrong person interpreted it. Priests held monopoly rights on diagnosing supernatural experiences. When a peasant woman claimed to see the Virgin Mary, church officials evaluated her social standing before the vision's content. A noble's daughter, describing heavenly apparitions, potentially miraculous. A poor widow with the same story, likely demonic deception. Records show clergy asking probing questions. Did the vision occur during prayer or after handling strange herbs? Did it align with scripture or describe bizarre scenarios? One 14th century manual advises priests to watch for physical signs. Glowing faces suggested divine contact, while frothing mouths indicated possession. Approved visionaries gained startling social mobility. Take Christina of Margate, a 12th century English mystic whose trances earned her an abbey founded in her honor. Nobles sought her prophecies. Bishops recorded her revelations as holy texts. Contrast this with an unnamed woman from Bavaria who recounted nearly identical experiences in 1281. She was starved until the demons left her body, then imprisoned for life. The difference? Christina came from wealthy merchant stock, while the Bavarian woman owed rent to local monks who found her inconvenient. Physical reactions dictated interpretations too. Peaceful euphoria often got classified as divine rapture. The swooning nuns of Loudun were considered blessed when they trembled silently during Mass. But if someone thrashed or screamed during their episode, priests reached for the exorcism manuals. A French case from 1373 describes two sisters eating the same ergot-infected bread. One sat calmly describing celestial music. The other tore her clothes while howling about snakes. The first was praised for her piety. The second was tied to a pillar for 3 days while clergy chanted over her. Substances played unspoken roles in these judgments. Visions arising spontaneously during prayer were safest. Those following herbal treatments raised eyebrows. Anything that altered perception was suspicious, as one churchman wrote. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Yet many accepted cases involved psychoactive incense or medicinal herbs. The key was never mentioning the physical cause. When Saint Teresa of Avila described ecstatic flights to heaven, no one inquired if her convent's migraine medications contained ergot. Women walked the tightrope most precariously. Male mystics could describe bizarre visions with relative impunity. St. Francis's sermon to birds was celebrated, while a peasant woman talking to her garden finches risked accusations of familiar spirits. Female ecstatics needed male clerics to validate their experiences. Hildegard von Bingen only began recording her visions after her confessor ordered her to, creating a paper trail that protected her. Unconnected women lacked this safeguard. A midwife's account of angelic childbirth guidance could be recast as hellish midwifery once she displeased local authorities. The rural-urban divide mattered. Village cunning folk often treated altered states as medical events, not spiritual crises. Herbalists knew Henbane sometimes made people see things that weren't there, just as fever could. But city-based inquisitors reinterpreted these practical observations as witchcraft confessions. Trial transcripts show healers unsuccessfully explaining, "I told her the Mandrake might make her imagine flying," only for judges to record, "The accused confesses to enchanting women to ride demons." Class shaped outcomes brutally. Wealthy visionaries could retreat to private chapels when episodes struck. The Duc de Berry commissioned tapestries depicting his celestial visions without consequence. Poor farmers, experiencing the same, found themselves hauled before courts. A 1426 Toulouse case involves a cobbler who described God's voice during a Belladonna overdose. The judge dismissed him until the cobbler mentioned it happened while mending the bishop's shoes. Suddenly his testimony became blasphemous mockery, earning him a year in irons. Some learned to game the system. Ambitious clerics realized that discovering visionaries could boost their careers. A lowly priest might suddenly promote a local girl's trances as miraculous, then ride her fame to a bishopric. Convents sometimes encouraged nuns' ecstasies to attract pilgrims' donations. The same Strasbourg church that burned a beguine for mystical claims in 1317 was exhibiting another woman's stigmata by 1345, timed conveniently after a fire destroyed their relic collection. A medieval peasant chewing on a strange mushroom wasn't looking for a good time. He was trying to survive another day in a world without painkillers or antidepressants. That's the fundamental difference between then and now. Today you take substances to enhance life. Back then, people used them to endure it. When your only options for pain relief are Henbane tea or screaming into a rag, you'll gamble on the tea every time, even if it makes you hallucinate spiders for 3 days. The context changed everything. Modernizing between 1 mile's developed groups doctors who'd been merged to open to save then. That self-changed, evolved. The often turn is a change the foster blending for them. What's another time? It is just trying to save when you fail modernize. We need though. They grain for us groups, becoming easily relationship, and it's still reduce. Senephus home deside and do this. Our home time was about to mania, ranning of ets. The Senephus read that the often eyes is a face. In the Senephus life is back, real decided to save has never doing the last ever years. The oftenizing now, watching to the say, Subner. The time was last in life head, and the dangers after side is life. The sidetary is the privering hours for the knowing much like. The family says that you had my optinize, has an asset at the song world pain, unprustoven. The Senephus ones I did, the vision takes semency, in that duration other time. Modern drug use happens against a backdrop of relative safety and comfort. You can reject substances because you have alternatives. Ibuprofen for headaches, therapy for depression, Netflix for boredom. Medieval people had none of that. Their altered states weren't recreational escapes, but desperate attempts to cope with reality. When an entire village ate ergot-infected bread and hallucinated together, it wasn't a party, it was Tuesday. The same substances we carefully dose for fun were their last resort against unrelenting misery. These spiritual needs drove medieval use in ways that seem alien now. Today's psychedelic enthusiasts might seek personal enlightenment, but medieval seekers wanted direct contact with the divine. Islamic scholars documented Hashish experiences with clinical precision, noting dosage effects on prayer focus. Christian mystics used psychoactive incense, hoping to glimpse heaven, not realizing the smoke itself was altering their perceptions. These weren't casual experiments. People risked execution for experiences they believed could save their souls. Compare that to modern festival goers taking mushrooms to see pretty colors. Medical necessity blurred all boundaries. A midwife giving Belladonna during childbirth knew it might cause visions, but she also knew the alternative was the mother dying in agony. Surgeons used Mandrake-laced sponges because patients preferred the risk of not waking up over being fully conscious during amputations. Modern medicine separates treatment from intoxication, but medieval healers had to accept that relieving suffering often meant altering minds unpredictably. Their side effects weren't minor inconveniences. They could be full-blown psychotic breaks that lasted weeks. Defiance at concept of dosage control would have baffled them. Today you can buy precisely measured edibles or know exactly how many micrograms of LSD are in a tab. Medieval users eyeballed everything. One handful of henbane seeds might ease your arthritis. The next handful could stop your heart. They lacked even basic concepts like potency variability between plants. A healer's reputation lived or died by whether today's batch of painkiller matched yesterday's, and often it didn't. Social attitudes followed necessity. Alcohol wasn't a weekend indulgence but a daily staple, with children drinking weak beer because the water wasn't safe. Taverns functioned as community hubs where drinking was secondary to socializing. Contrast that with modern bars, where the goal is often intoxication itself. Medieval people didn't have alcoholism as a concept. They had that guy who keeps falling in the pig pen, which everyone agreed was annoying, but not a disease. The Islamic Golden Age showed what systematic study could achieve. While European peasants poisoned themselves guessing at herb doses, Islamic scholars recorded hashish effects with scientific rigor. They noted differences between smoked and ingested highs, tracked how fasting changed experiences, and warned against dangerous combinations. Their approach resembled modern clinical trials more than medieval Europe's "let's see what happens" experimentation. The same substance that got European women burned as witches was studied dispassionately in Baghdad. Modern drug stigmas trace straight back to medieval fears. The Church's suspicion of altered states wasn't about morality, but control. If people could access spiritual experiences without priests, the whole power structure collapsed. Today's war on drugs echoes that same anxiety. Authorities fear substances that let people escape prescribed realities. Medieval inquisitors and modern politicians both label certain experiences dangerous when they threaten the status quo. Excessively, some medieval attitudes were shockingly pragmatic. Monks brewing 12% ABV beer weren't judged for intoxication. They were praised for creating safe hydration. Towns tolerated local herb women as long as their cures worked more often than they killed. The line between healer and witch usually depended on results, not principles. Compare that to modern zero-tolerance policies that ignore context completely. The biggest difference lies in interpretation. When a medieval person hallucinated, they believed it was real, either divine vision or demonic attack. Modern users understand these experiences as chemical reactions in the brain. That cognitive shift changes everything. Medieval peasants thought they'd actually attended witches' sabbaths. Today, we recognize those as bad trips from poorly made salves. Yet both eras share the same human craving to escape ordinary consciousness, whether for survival, spirituality, or simple curiosity. Mozilla really connects medieval and modern mindsets is fear of the unknown. Then they feared demonic possession. Now we fear losing control. Both societies police altered states, not because they're inherently dangerous, but because they challenge authorities' monopoly on reality. The substances haven't changed much. Henbane still causes delirium. Cannabis still alters perception. But our reasons for using them reveal more about our societies than the drugs themselves. Ilaro will examine the lost stories, the countless ordinary people whose experiences vanished from history because they didn't fit official narratives. For every recorded saint's vision, there were hundreds of peasants who tripped on bad bread and kept quiet about it. Their silence speaks volumes about who gets to define reality and who gets punished for seeing things differently. 700 years haven't changed much. We still label altered states as either enlightenment or addiction. just like medieval priests decided visions came from God or Satan. Those peasants rubbing hallucinogenic ointments on their skin weren't so different from modern kids experimenting with edibles, both searching for something beyond daily life. The real lesson isn't about the substances, but about control. Societies still fear what they can't regulate, whether it's a witch's flying ointment or psychedelic therapy. Maybe we've advanced from burning heretics to prescribing SSRI, but we're still wrestling with the same basic question. Who gets to define what's in someone else's mind?